Welcome to today's episode. We are going to travel together, at least in our imagination, to the small hilltop town of Assisi, in the heart of the Umbrian countryside of central Italy. There, rising above the rooftops and visible for miles across the rolling green hills, stands one of the most extraordinary Christian monuments in the world, the Basilica Papale di San Francesco d'Assisi, the Papal Basilica of St. Francis of Assisi. This is not simply a beautiful old church. It is a living place of faith, a UNESCO World Heritage Site, the mother church of the Franciscan order, and the resting place of a man whose life continues to move and challenge people of every background, nearly 8 centuries after his death. More than 4 to 5 million people visit Assisi each year, and a growing number register as pilgrims at the Basilica itself. Over 4,400 in the year 2024 alone, a new record. In this episode, we will walk through the Basilica's remarkable architecture, explore its deep and sometimes dramatic history, reflect on its profound spiritual importance, and discover why it continues to matter so greatly to the people of Umbria, to Catholics around the world, and to all who carry even a quiet interest in the meeting place of art, faith, and human longing. There are also a few stories along the way that will surprise you. Chapter 1: Architecture. Let us start with the building itself, because standing before it for the first time is genuinely breathtaking. The Basilica of St. Francis is not one church. It is 2 churches, built one on top of the other, climbing up the western flank of a hill. This double structure, known as the Upper Basilica and the Lower Basilica, creates one of the most unusual and visually striking religious complexes anywhere in the Christian world. The story of the building begins in 1228. Barely 2 years after Francis of Assisi died. Pope Gregory IX had just canonized Francis on July 16th of that year, and on the very next day, July 17th, 1228, he personally laid the first stone of the new church. The speed is remarkable. It tells us something important. This was not a project born of slow institutional planning. There was urgency, there was devotion, there was a desire to honor this extraordinary man immediately and permanently. The land on which the basilica stands had been donated just months earlier, on March 29, 1228, by a local man named Simone di Pucciarello. He gave to the papacy the summit of a hill on the western edge of Assisi. And here is a detail that stays with you once you know it. That hill had previously been used as a place of execution. Criminals were put to death there. In the local language, it was known as the Col dell'Inferno, the Hill of Hell. When the basilica rose upon it, the hill was renamed. It became the Col del Paradiso, the Hill of Paradise. A more perfect inversion is difficult to imagine. The architect of record for both the upper and lower churches was a man known to history as Maestro Jacopo Tedesco, Master Jacob the German, who in those days was considered the most celebrated architect working in the region. But the construction was supervised on the ground by a figure who is absolutely central to the entire Franciscan story. Brother Elias of Cortona, one of the first companions of Francis, his former vicar general, and a man of remarkable practical gifts. Brother Elias had spent time in Syria as a hermit, where he had gained experience building large stone structures, including sepulchres carved from rock. He brought that knowledge back to Assisi. The lower basilica was completed first, in 1230. It was built in the Umbrian Romanesque style, with strong Lombard influences. Heavy, solid, with low semicircular ribbed vaults over the nave, and barrel vaults over the transept arms. The nave follows a Latin cross plan. The overall effect is one of quiet, sheltered intimacy. You enter from a large portico and immediately feel enclosed, held as if in a crypt, which is precisely what Brother Elias intended. He designed the lower basilica as an enormous crypt to protect and honor the body of the saint. The ceiling is relatively low, the light is dim, and the walls are so richly covered in frescoes that at first the eye barely knows where to look. The upper basilica, construction of which began after 1239 and was completed in 1253, is entirely different in spirit. Here the architectural style shifts to French Gothic. Soaring, luminous, vertical. The nave consists of 4 great bays, with pointed ribbed cross vaulting, and tall Gothic windows flood the interior with light. Where the lower church draws you inward and downward, the upper church lifts you upward and outward. Both churches were consecrated together by Pope Innocent IV in 1253, a ceremony that marked the official completion of the complex, though additions and chapels continued to be added well into the 14th and 15th centuries. One of the most distinctive architectural features of the entire complex is the material from which it is built. Stone from nearby Mount Subasio, the great mountain that watches over Assisi in the Umbrian Valley below. This local limestone has a quality that is almost impossible to describe adequately. During the day it glows pink and warm, but under moonlight it turns white and luminous. This is the same stone that gives the whole town of Assisi its characteristic color, the rose gold warmth that photographers love and that pilgrims remember long after they have returned home. The choice of local Subasio stone was not accidental. It bound the basilica physically and visually to the land, to the region, to the very mountain that Francis himself loved to pray upon. To the left of the two churches stands a freestanding Romanesque bell tower, completed in 1239, which adds a strong vertical accent to the silhouette of the complex. The friary of the Sacro Convento, the sacred convent, wraps around and supports the basilica from below with imposing walls and 53 Romanesque arches. From the valley, the whole complex looks like a fortified city growing organically out of the hillside. The upper church's facade deserves special attention. It is divided horizontally into two zones of roughly equal height and features a single large doorway in the Gothic style, crowned by a magnificent rose window. Above it, in the gable, sits a small circular ocular window. The symbols of the four evangelists are carved around the central rose window: Matthew the man, Mark the lion, Luke the ox, and John the eagle, combining with the window to create a square composition of great symbolic richness. To the left of the facade stands the Benediction loggia in the Baroque style, added in 1754 when the basilica was raised to the status of a patriarchal basilica by Pope Benedict XIV. Inside the lower church, the space was expanded over time by the addition of numerous lateral chapels between roughly 1270 and 1400, commissioned by noble families and high-ranking churchmen, each contributing their own decorative programs. The main entrance to the nave is through an ornate Gothic doorway built between 1280 and 1300, which is enclosed by a Renaissance porch added in 1487. Set into the tympanum of this doorway is a large rose window that admirers have sometimes called, with no false modesty, the eye of the most beautiful church in the world. The upper church interior is exceptional in a different way. Its walls were left relatively plain and smooth in the upper registers, specifically so they could receive the great cycles of frescoes that would be painted there in the following decades. The choir in the upper church contains 102 magnificent wooden stalls with carvings and inlaid marquetry work by Domenico Indovini, completed in 1501. At their center, on a raised platform, stands the Papal Cathedra, the throne reserved for the Pope, a reminder that this is a papal church in the fullest sense. And then there are the frescoes. No description of the basilica's architecture can ignore the frescoes, because the art and the architecture are inseparable here. The walls are the frescoes. The frescoes are the walls. The great names of late medieval Italian painting worked here: Cimabue, Giotto di Bondone, Simone Martini, Pietro Lorenzetti, and others less famous but no less devoted. The stained glass windows, too, are extraordinary. Some attributed to German craftsmen working in Assisi at the end of the 13th century, others to French workshops, others to the workshop of the Maestro di San Francesco. They represent some of the finest examples of 13th century Italian glasswork in existence. In the upper church, the lower register of the nave walls, the part closest to the faithful who would enter and walk through the space, is covered with the celebrated cycle of 28 scenes from the life of St. Francis, attributed to Giotto and his workshop, and painted between roughly 1296 and 1304. These are among the most important paintings in Western art history, not only because of their quality and their narrative power, but because of what they represent technically and artistically. Giotto showed real people with real emotions in real spaces. He introduced depth, shadow, and psychological life into a tradition that had, until that point, dealt largely in flat, symbolic representation. The Basilica of Assisi is, among other things, the birthplace of a new way of seeing. The walls of the upper church also carry, in the upper registers, 32 scenes from the Old and New Testaments, from the creation of the world to the women at the tomb, painted by a team of Roman and Tuscan masters following in the tradition of Cimabue. In the lower church, the chapel of St. Martin is covered with 10 frescoes by the Sienese master Simone Martini, painted between 1317 and 1319, and considered among the finest examples of 14th century Italian painting. The left transept carries a breathtaking cycle of the Passion of Christ by Pietro Lorenzetti, painted between 1315 and 1330. And in the vault above the main altar, Giotto in his workshop painted the famous allegorical figures representing the three great Franciscan vows of obedience, poverty, and chastity, together with the image of St. Francis in glory. Chapter 2. History. To understand the history of the Basilica, we need to go back a little further, to the life of the man it was built to honor. Francis of Assisi was born in 1181 or 1182, the sources differ on the exact year, to Pietro di Bernardone, a prosperous cloth merchant, and his wife Pica, who is believed to have been of French or Provençal origin. His father was away on business in France when the child was born, and his mother had him baptized with the name Giovanni. When Pietro returned, he gave the boy a different name, Francesco, Francis, perhaps in honor of France, perhaps as a gesture of affection for all things French, which the merchant adored. Francis grew up enjoying the privileges of a wealthy family. He was sociable, generous, charming, and deeply attracted to the world of knights and courtly ideals. He fought in the war between Assisi and the neighboring city of Perugia, was captured, and spent nearly a year as a prisoner of war in harsh conditions. The experience shook him. After his release, his father ransomed him, and he returned home ill and changed. A series of spiritual experiences followed. A dream that turned him back from a military campaign, an encounter with a leper whom he had always found repulsive, but whom he now embraced, and a moment in the ruined chapel of San Damiano, where he heard the voice of Christ saying, "Francis, go and repair my house, which as you see is falling into ruin." He would spend his whole life understanding what that command meant. He gave up his inheritance, publicly renounced his father before the Bishop of Assisi, and began a life of radical poverty and service to the poor, the sick, and the outcast. His joy was infectious. Companions gathered around him. In 1209, Pope Innocent III gave verbal approval to Francis's simple rule, and the Franciscan order, the Order of Friars Minor, was born. It would grow to become the largest religious order in the world. Francis went on to preach throughout Italy and beyond. In 1219, during the Fifth Crusade, he crossed enemy lines and met the Sultan of Egypt, Al-Kamil, in a gesture of radical openness that astonished both sides. In 1224, on the mountain of Laverna in Tuscany, during an intense period of prayer and contemplation, Francis received the stigmata, the 5 wounds of the crucified Christ, in his hands, his feet, and his side. He was the first person in recorded history to receive them. 2 years later, on October 3, 1226, he died in the chapel near the Porciuncola, the little church at the foot of Assisi's hill that he had always loved most. He was buried temporarily in the church of San Giorgio in Assisi. The day after his death, Brother Elias, who had been at his side, wrote a letter to all the friars of the order, announcing the passing of Francis and describing the stigmata. He called it a great joy and a new miracle. Less than 2 years later, on July 16, 1228, Gregory IX canonized Francis in Assisi, and, the very next day, laid the foundation stone of the basilica that would bear his name. Pope Gregory IX was the driving force behind the entire project. He had known Francis personally, had admired and supported him, and was determined that the new saint should have a building worthy of his significance. Through the papal bull known as Recolentes, issued on April 29, 1228, he declared the Basilica a special church of the Holy See, a specialis ecclesia. He called upon the faithful throughout Christendom to contribute to its construction and its support. The land had been donated by Simone de Pucciarello. The papacy accepted the gift and placed the church under direct papal authority. By May 1230, enough of the lower basilica had been completed to receive the remains of Francis. On Pentecost Sunday, May 25, 1230, in a solemn procession, the body of the saint was translated from the Church of San Giorgio to the new basilica. And here is where history takes an unexpected and slightly dramatic turn. Brother Elias, the supervisor of construction and the man most responsible for the physical building, made a decision that would puzzle and trouble people for nearly 6 centuries. He concealed the exact location of Francis's tomb. He buried the saint in a secret place beneath the floor of the lower basilica and told almost no one where he lay. The reasons for this secrecy are not entirely clear. Brother Elias himself wrote of the fear that the saint's relics might be seized and dispersed across Europe, a very real danger in the relic-hungry medieval world. Whatever his reasons, the concealment worked almost too well. For nearly 600 years, the exact location of Francis's remains was unknown. It was only in 1818, during the reign of Pope Pius VII, that a sustained search finally uncovered the tomb beneath the floor of the lower basilica. A crypt was then constructed so that the faithful could come and pray beside the saint's resting place. The crypt was redesigned between 1925 and 1932 by the architect Ugo Tarci in a bare neo-Romanesque style that stripped away the earlier neoclassical decoration and gave the space the sober dignity it retains today. The basilica's formal status evolved over time. In 1230, Gregory IX issued a second papal bull, known as Is Qui Ecclesiam, which conferred upon the basilica the title of Caput Mater of the Franciscan order, head and mother. This was a declaration of its central importance to the entire order. Its care was entrusted in perpetuity to the friars of the community, who would later form the Order of Friars Minor Conventual. In 1288, Pope Nicholas IV, the first Franciscan ever to be elected pope, raised the church to the status of a papal church, bringing it even more directly under the authority and protection of the Holy See. In 1754, Pope Benedict XIV elevated it to the dignity of a patriarchal basilica and a papal chapel. And in 2006, when Pope Benedict XVI renounced the ancient title of Patriarch of the West, the basilica's name was updated accordingly, and it became the Papal Basilica, Basilica Papale, as it is known today. Among the notable historical figures connected to the basilica, we must mention John of Brienne, King of Jerusalem and Regent of Constantinople, who is buried in the lower church. His monument stands as evidence of the basilica's prestige and international reach even in the 13th century. Cardinal Egidio Albornoz, the powerful papal legate who reunified the papal states in the mid-14th century, was initially buried in the chapel of St. Catherine of Alexandria, though his body was later transferred to Toledo, Spain. The chapel itself was decorated at his expense, and it contains a magnificent series of frescoes about the life of St. Catherine. One historical figure deserves special attention for the warmth of her story. Her name was Jacopa dei Sedisoli, Lady Jacoba. She was a Roman noblewoman of an aristocratic family, widowed young, who became one of the closest friends and most devoted supporters of Francis during his lifetime. She extended hospitality to him and his brothers in Rome, helped establish the first Franciscan residence there, and contributed significantly to the funding of the basilica's construction. Francis affectionately called her brother Jacoba because she had, as he saw it, the spirit and the dedication of a true friar. When Francis was dying, he sent for her, but according to the tradition, she had already felt the call and was already on her way, arriving at the Porciuncola with a burial shroud and the almond cookies that Francis had always loved. She was at his side when he died. After her own death, probably in 1239, she was buried in the crypt of the basilica near the tomb of Francis. Her remains rest there to this day. It is a remarkable thing. This woman who was called brother is buried among the brothers. In more recent history, the basilica has been the site of 2 extraordinary gatherings called by Pope John Paul II. On October 27, 1986, He invited representatives of more than 120 different religions and Christian denominations to Assisi for a World Day of Prayer for Peace, an event that was widely seen as one of the most significant gestures of interreligious dialogue in the modern papacy. The gathering was repeated in January 2002, following the attacks of September 11, 2001. Assisi and the Basilica of St. Francis became, in both moments, a symbolic center of the world's longing for peace. And then there is the earthquake. On September 26, 1997, two earthquakes struck the Umbrian region in rapid succession, registering 5.7 and 6.0 on the Richter scale. While a group of Franciscan friars and art specialists were inside the upper basilica inspecting the initial damage, a powerful aftershock caused a section of the vaulted ceiling to collapse. 4 people were killed, 2 friars and 2 members of the inspection team. It was a terrible tragedy, and it was also, for the history of art, a moment of devastating loss. Cimabue's great fresco cycle on the vaults of the upper church, among the most precious examples of 13th century Italian painting, was shattered into some 120,000 fragments, scattered across the floor. What followed was one of the most extraordinary restoration efforts in modern history. Teams of conservators descended on Assisi and spent years piecing together the fragments, some no larger than a crumb, using computer software, photographic records, and an almost unimaginable patience. The church was closed for 2 years and partially reopened in stages. The final phase of the restoration was completed and publicly celebrated in April 2006. The restored vaults, bearing the ghostly beauty of what remained of Cimabue's frescoes, were unveiled to the world. The basilica had survived. It was wounded, but it had survived. Chapter 3: Spiritual Importance. The Basilica of St. Francis is, before everything else, a place of encounter. Between the believer and the saint, between the human and the holy, between the present moment and the long, luminous tradition of Christian faith. It is dedicated to St. Francis of Assisi, and every aspect of its architecture, its art, and its liturgy is ordered toward making that dedication visible and tangible. Francis himself was, and this is a point that the medieval church pressed with great theological intention, understood to be an alter Christus, another Christ. The Latin phrase is precise and demanding. It does not mean simply that Francis was a very good Christian. It means that the friars and theologians of the 13th century, looking at his life, and especially at the stigmata he had received, saw in him a man who had so fully conformed himself to the life, the suffering, and the love of Jesus that he bore in his own body the marks of the crucified one. This was the most audacious spiritual claim that could be made about a human being short of divinity itself. This theological idea is embedded in the very structure of the basilica's art. In the lower church, the earliest frescoes on the nave walls, painted around 1253 by the unknown artist known as the Master of St. Francis, place scenes from the Passion of Christ on one wall and scenes from the life of Francis on the opposite wall. The juxtaposition is not accidental. It is a visual argument. Look at Christ, now look at Francis, and see the same story. The basilica was designed from the beginning as a place where pilgrims would come to understand Francis through Christ and Christ through Francis. The stigmata themselves deserve a moment of reflection. In 1224, Francis had retreated to the mountain of Laverna in Tuscany with 2 companions for a period of intense prayer and fasting. The feast of the exaltation of the Holy Cross was approaching. During a vision, a seraph appeared to him, a 6-winged angel, seeming to be crucified on a cross. And then the wounds appeared, in his hands, in his feet, in his side, the marks of nails and a lance wound. Francis was reported to have concealed them as much as he could out of humility, but they were witnessed by his companions. After his death, when his body was washed and prepared for burial, the marks were clearly visible. Brother Elias described them in his letter to the order. Pope Gregory IX mentioned them in the papal bull of canonization. They were the sign, the seal, of a life entirely given over to love. The basilica's crypt, with its ancient stone coffin holding the remains of Francis, is the most sacred place in the entire complex. Visitors descend into it by a double staircase and find themselves in a bare, dimly lit space of extraordinary stillness. Above the altar, the stone sarcophagus is visible in an open space. Around it, set into the corners of the surrounding walls, are the tombs of four of Francis's most faithful brothers, Rufino, Angelo, Maceo, and Leo. Near the entrance to the crypt stands the urn containing the remains of Jacopo de Settisoli. The simplicity of the space is deliberate. It echoes the simplicity of Francis himself, who asked to be laid on bare ground at the moment of his death, who owned nothing, who refused all privilege. Above the stone coffin in the crypt burns the votive lamp, the lampada votiva, and its presence is one of the most beautiful continuing traditions in the life of the Basilica. The tradition of a burning lamp has deep roots in the spirituality of Francis himself. Early in his conversion, he went to the ruined chapel of San Damiano and offered money to the priest there so that oil could be purchased to keep a lamp burning before the image of Christ. He was quoted as saying that the lamp should not be deprived, not even for a moment, of the due honor of its light. The votive lamp in the crypt was inaugurated on October 1st, 1939, at the moment when Pope Pius XII proclaimed Francis the primary patron saint of Italy. It was designed by the architect Ugo Tarchi, 120 centimeters tall, in polished bronze and silver, with a central axis in the form of a cross, rising to a hemispherical form symbolizing the world. Around the rim of the cup, words from Dante's Divine Comedy are inscribed. Below it, 3 silver doves hold an olive crown in their beaks, a symbol of peace. Every year on the Feast of St. Francis, October the 4th, one of the regions of Italy brings an offering of oil to feed this lamp for the following year. The ceremony is broadcast live on Italian national television. Tuscany, Lombardy, Abruzzo, Valle d'Aosta, one region at a time in rotation, makes this gesture on behalf of all Italy. It is a moment of national unity around a common inheritance. The lamp burns before the tomb, not as a symbol of death, but as a symbol of living love, of the flame that Francis kindled and that, in the faith of those who gather here, has never gone out. The Basilica is also the caput mater of the entire Franciscan order, the head and mother. This is not merely an honorific title. It means that every Franciscan community in the world, in all its many branches, is spiritually connected to this place. When friars and sisters make their profession, when new communities are formed, when the order gathers for its most solemn occasions, the thread leads back to this hill, to this building, to the man buried beneath the altar in the crypt. The Basilica is the heartbeat of a global family. It is worth noting, too, that the Basilica has always drawn people who are not Catholic and not Christian. The spirituality of Francis, with its openness to nature, its embrace of the poor, its radical simplicity, and its insistence on the dignity of every living creature, has a universal resonance that crosses every boundary. Hindus, Buddhists, Jews, Muslims, people of no formal religious affiliation, all have found in Francis a figure who speaks to something deep and recognizable in human experience. Pope Francis, who took the name of the Assisi saint when he was elected in 2013, was the first pope in history to choose that name, a deliberate sign of the direction he wished to give his pontificate, toward simplicity, toward the poor, toward fraternity with all. The liturgical life of the Basilica is rich and continuous. Masses are celebrated daily in both churches. The Capella Musicale, the music chapel of the Papal Basilica, was founded in 1230, the very year the lower basilica was completed, when a friar named Brother Julian of Speyer was charged with composing a rhythmic office in honor of Francis, and most likely became the first choir master of the new basilica. In the medieval period, the basilica was a major European center for the creation and performance of sacred music. Among the illustrious names in its long musical history is Brother Girolamo de Ruta, who wrote a work known as the Transilvano in 1593, the first and most authoritative theoretical work on the art of keyboard music. The Capella Musicale continues to serve the basilica today, performing at solemn liturgical celebrations throughout the year, and it has performed in concert halls and churches across Europe and the world. The basilica also houses a magnificent organ in the upper church, built in 1982 with 3 manuals and a full pedal board. A large and powerful instrument suited to the great space of the Gothic nave. In the lower church, an older 18th century organ still serves the more intimate liturgical needs of that space. The tradition of organ music at Assisi reaches back centuries, and visiting musicians and choirs from around the world regularly perform here as part of the Sagra Musicale Umbria, the Umbrian Sacred Music Festival, one of the oldest and most prestigious classical music festivals in Italy. Summary: the Basilica Papale di San Francesco d'Assisi is a place of many layers. Architecturally, it is a synthesis of Romanesque solidity and Gothic light, built from the rose-tinted stone of the local mountain, carrying within its walls some of the most important paintings in the history of Western art. Historically, it was born from an act of devotion and speed. The foundation stone laid the day after a canonization, and it has survived earthquake, artistic controversy, the concealment of its greatest treasure for 6 centuries, and the slow work of time. Spiritually, it is dedicated to a man who understood the world as a mirror of God, who called all creatures his brothers and sisters, who bore in his body the marks of the crucified Christ, and who is buried in the simplest stone coffin, in the humblest possible corner of a grand basilica, with a lamp burning above him and the sound of music drifting down from the church above. It is the head and mother of a global religious family, the resting place of a woman who was called brother, and a symbol of peace that popes have repeatedly chosen as the setting for the world's most urgent conversations. Today, it draws millions of people each year: pilgrims, tourists, artists, believers, seekers, and the merely curious. It shapes the identity of the entire region of Umbria. It inspires composers, painters, poets, and ordinary people trying to make sense of their lives. And it continues, day after day, to do exactly what it was built to do: hold the memory of Francis, offer a space for prayer, and keep the lamp burning. Thank you for joining us on this journey to Assisi. May the spirit of that little hill, the Colle del Paradiso, stay with you for a while. In case you enjoyed this episode, please like it and share it with your friends. It really helps us.